Now, critically, the reality of the resurrection is not an isolated event. It is part and parcel of a world and life view. A big story about reality, we might say a meta-narrative that coherently hangs together and appears plausible and necessary within that context, within that particular account of reality. Outside of a worldview that acknowledges God and his freedom to act in the world, the resurrection makes no more sense than Bugs Bunny showing up with Iron Man in a Marvel movie. It just wouldn't fit.
The first manuscript we have of that is Papyrus 46. Now this is dated about 125 to 175 years after the event. That is a significant gap of time. I'm not saying that the original manuscript definitely did not contain, for example, he was buried or he appeared to one of the individuals that's named, but rather we can't know what the original said. We are in a position of agnosticism.
Hello and welcome to Unbelievable, the show that aims to get Christians and non-Christians talking about topics that matter to all of us. I'm Ruth Jackson and this week's Unbelievable was recorded live at Aylesbury High School with the help of Aylesbury Youth for Christ. Dr Joseph Boot and Harry Amos joined me to discuss the question, did Jesus rise from the dead? Rev Dr Joseph Boot is founder and president of the Ezra Institute for Contemporary Christianity. He's written numerous books, including Searching for Truth, Why I Still Believe, and How Then Shall We Answer. Joe's spoken all over the world, from Eton College here in the UK to Forman University in Lahore, Pakistan. Harry Amos studied philosophy, politics and economics at university, and during this time he moved from Christianity to agnostic atheism. I'll let him explain what he means by that, but through this process he started a fascinating blog called the Book of Amos. The format of this following discussion was slightly different from our usual Unbelievables in that we began by each of the guests putting forward their side of the debate. So Joe began by arguing that Jesus did rise from the dead, and then Harry shared the reasons he thinks Jesus did not rise from the dead. In the second part of the show, we moved into a more of a sort of normal discussion format, and in the final section, Harry and Joe responded to some of the questions that the young people who attended the event asked them. Before all of this, though, I asked Harry to explain what he means when he calls himself an agnostic atheist.
So I would describe myself as an agnostic atheist. This often confuses people because they think, wait, hang on, you can't be both things at once. I guess a saying that I often use is no one owns the dictionary. Now you could say that Oxford owns the dictionary or Merriam-Webster, but what I mean is more that everyone means different things by the words that they use. So faith, for example, people might say, oh, it's belief without evidence, or they might say it's the gap between the evidence that I have leaping to actually acting on that belief. So people define, it's all like God. God is defined in many different ways. So for me, atheism means I do not believe positively that God exists. Agnosticism for me is that I don't know, because that's literally what the terms mean. A is a prefix meaning not, and therefore I am not a theist. I don't believe positively that God exists, and I also don't claim to know whether he does one way or another. So that's, I guess, my starting point.
Joe, I'm apologising here for our clashing jackets, by the way. This was not intended. Harry didn't get the memo to have some sort of pink in his attire. But Joe, why do you believe that Jesus did rise from the dead?
Thank you. Well, it's good to see you all here. Thank you for coming. Special thank you to Youth for Christ, to Sam for putting this on, for the lovely Ruth for hosting it, and Harry. It's been great to get to know Harry. Spent a chunk of the day with him and to make a new friend, so that's great. The question for our discussion today is, did Jesus rise from the dead? And as has already been pointed out, this is a very, very important question. One famous English philosopher called Cyril E. Joad once said, the most important question in the world is, did Jesus Christ rise from the dead? And the reason he said that is that the resurrection would vindicate the teaching and the claims of the Lord Jesus to being the Son of God. It would confirm his teaching in Scripture concerning sin and salvation, that he is the way, the truth, and the life. And I think that's the central reason why the answer to the question is so critically important for all of us. Now, to be clear, I am not debating this issue today because it's doubtful. I am a Christian, and I believe with certainty that Jesus Christ is alive and is the source of all truth, meaning, and purpose. But I'm part of the discussion because the miracle of the resurrection and its evidences are an attention grabber. They're an attention getter that often draws people to consider the claims of Jesus Christ for themselves. And that's what I hope you will do. And I think that's the purpose of this debate today, this discussion. The resurrection is actually offered in Scripture and the preaching of the church as the greatest proof of Christ's identity. Having said that, let me humbly say to you, I do not prove the proof to you. That would be absurd, for the truth claims about God, God's claims about himself, would then be dependent on me. I'm not that arrogant. I'm not God. God alone can bring you to that full understanding. If Prince Charles was here today with his crown and his robes on, and I were to set about proving his existence to you, you would consider that incredibly rude. And I believe God is present. He's present. And each of us, in the depths of our own being, know that we're creatures who are accountable to God. So nobody proves their proof as such. The Christian task is really to bear witness to the truth. And in our arguments, that's what we're trying to do as well, to bear witness. And even by my own experience of the resurrected Christ, I want to bear witness. And that's also the faith of about 2.4 billion people in the world today. And that in and of itself is testimony worth considering, that so many people 2,000 years on believe that Jesus Christ rose from the grave. Now, critically, the reality of the resurrection is not an isolated event. It is part and parcel of a world and life view. Now, a big story about reality, we might say a meta-narrative that coherently hangs together and appears plausible and necessary within that context, within that particular account of reality. Outside of a worldview that acknowledges God and his freedom to act in the world, the resurrection makes no more sense than Bugs Bunny showing up with Iron Man in a Marvel movie. It just wouldn't fit. Remember, the claim is not that Jesus rose naturally from the dead. That's an impossibility. Dead people don't rise. Rather, it's that God raised Jesus from the dead. God raised Jesus from the dead. So you see that your worldview, and everybody has one, all of you here, all of you listening, have a world and life view. You have a perspective on reality with basic faith commitments, with basic religious commitments that will shape what you do with any evidence that's presented to you. Our spiritual and our moral attitude towards God is defining in how we approach such questions. And a step in either direction is a step that involves faith commitment, religious commitment, one way or another. Today's discussion involves considering some basic historical evidences or facts, but these are not data sheets. We don't establish historical events like solving maths problems with some kind of deductive certitude. It's much more like the legal way of discovering truth in a court of law. The past is gone. Have you traveled in time? The past is gone. History and its objects are not directly accessible to us. The best we do with history is reconstruct it as faithfully as we can based on sources and testimony and the debris of the past. And then we must interpret that data according to a particular framework. The historian can say, based on numerous sources, that Jesus almost certainly died on a cross around AD 30 near Jerusalem under the orders of Roman Procurator Pontius Pilate. But he cannot say whether God accepted Jesus' death as a sacrifice for sin. That's a different type of question, and it goes to the religious root of our life. So what I'm saying to you is there is a difference between the historical evidence or the data and the explanation of that evidence. The evidence or data is not actually particularly controversial. It's the explanation of the evidence that is controversial, because it's controlled by worldview commitments that fall outside the competence of the historian. In fact, every historian brings his or her own assumptions to the evidence. So let's have a quick look at what the data actually is. We have 5 high-quality independent sources. We've got the 4 Gospels and the Apostle Paul's writings, whose source material, most scholars would agree, dates back within about 7 years of the resurrection of Jesus. The complete gospel texts go back to within 40 years of the events. And these sources agree on 4 facts accepted by the vast majority of critical New Testament scholars today. First of all, the death and burial of Jesus during the Passover feast in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. Second, the empty tomb of Jesus found by women followers, including Mary Magdalene. Third, the reports of post-mortem appearances of Jesus to individuals and groups at various times and circumstances for 40 days. And fourth, the disciples' belief in the resurrection and their preaching of it in Jerusalem within 7 weeks of Jesus' death, and therefore the birth of the Christian church. Now, these pieces of historical information or data are no more in doubt than that Caesar crossed the Rubicon or that Jerusalem fell in AD 70. No ancient histories meet idealistic criteria, but the sources are certainly, in my judgment, too early to be legends. We have independent sources for Matthew and John, as well as Mark, and we have we have Mark and Luke as well, or Luke Acts and Paul's letters. And Paul had been an opponent of the Christian church and a persecutor of Christians. And he was dramatically converted in AD 33. And in 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8, written around AD 53, he cites the earliest Christian tradition, which he likely received from Peter and James during a 2-week stay with them after his conversion. And I'll read that to you. For I passed on to you as most important what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to over 500 brothers at one time. Most of them are still alive, but some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one abnormally born, he also appeared to me. Now, that the disciples taught and believed those things cannot be reasonably doubted. These things were the uniform claim of the early church. It was the preaching of the early church. And remarkably, they were ready to be imprisoned and to even die for the good news that they proclaimed. The Jewish historian Josephus in the 1st century records that in 60 AD, James, the brother of Jesus, who prior to the resurrection didn't even believe in Christ, was martyred for his faith. Think about that. What would it take for you to believe that your brother or sister was the Son of God and was raised from the dead, and to be prepared to die for it? There are actually no competing burial stories or legends, and the body of Jesus has never been found. The Christian movement arose through preaching the resurrection in the very city in which he was crucified. And yet neither the Jewish nor Roman authorities could produce the body to refute their claims, despite knowing the burial location and having set guards on it. And the story the Jewish authorities came up with, that the disciples somehow rolled away the stone and stole the body while the guards slept, showed the authorities did not have the body. Most of the witnesses were still alive to be consulted when Paul wrote his first letter to the church in Corinth. So I would argue that the data itself is relatively uncontroversial. In a sense, the evidence isn't miraculous, but the explanation for the data is what is at issue. And I think we're left with 3 basic choices. 1, it's a conspiracy some sort of hoax or conspiracy, that these disciples invented this story and they went on to be persecuted and die for the lie that they knew they had invented. Second, they were deceived, or they were deluded or hallucinated in some way. Hundreds of people at different times in different places. In fact, for about 40 days, on 12 different occasions, over 500 people saw appearances of Jesus, 3 of which he ate food with them. Third, Jesus didn't die, but somehow revived in the tomb, that the whipping and the Roman crucifixion did not kill him, but somehow he swooned in the tomb, managed to roll the stone away and present himself to his disciples as plausibly resurrected. Or the resurrection really happened, that these morally upright people told the truth, and that they died for the truth. I don't believe that naturalistic accounts of the resurrection adequately account for what happened that great day. And positively, based on the 4 primary evidences cited, the resurrection claim, I think, is compelling. I'm not going to say it forces you to believe. There have been philosophers who've said, well, there's a 97% probability based on the background evidence that Jesus was raised from the dead, Richard Swinburne at Oxford. Okay, fine. But that's not going to, probabilistic arguments from mathematics aren't going to convince you of the resurrection. But I put it to you that Jesus is alive, that you can know him, because if he is alive, you can know him. And I would encourage you to read the Gospels this Easter, maybe say a prayer, ask God to reveal Christ to you, maybe ask a Christian to take you to church, hear preaching on the resurrection. Come and see for yourself. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Harry, just to be clear, you're not going to be responding to anything that Joe has said there, but you've got your own 10 minutes or so reason on the opposite side of the argument, or debate, or discussion, for why you don't think the resurrection actually happened.
Sure. So thanks for presenting that. So in terms of, I do take a more evidentialist, historian-type lens to this question. While I acknowledge the importance of worldview in approaching the question at hand, did Jesus rise from the dead? Note that I will not argue no, he didn't, but rather that I don't think that there is good or sufficient evidence to say that he rose from the dead, or to say that he probably rose from the dead. What is a sufficient standard of evidence? So some philosophers, such as Hume, would say a miracle by definition is the least likely explanation of any historical event. Now, I have some sympathy with that approach. However, I will not defend it, and it's not one that I necessarily hold. I do think, however, that we should apply a very high bar of evidence. There may be a miraculous explanation for, as Joe explained, say, the 4 facts that he presented, and I will dispute those in due course. But it's the case that there would need to be a very high bar of evidence presented in order for me to accept that as the most likely explanation. And indeed, history deals with what probably happened in the past. As Joe says, we can't prove it. But he aptly compared, I wrote down, he said it's not about maths, it's not about logic, kind of formal logical proofs. He said the legal way of approaching things. So what would count in a court of law to convict someone? As Joe said, it's a very important question. In the same way, to my mind anyway, as if I were sat on a jury and thinking about what would it take for me to return a guilty verdict in a murder trial. What would it take equally, as you're sat here, whether at home listening to this, or equally anyone in the audience, what would it take to change your mind? Even if I present to you a natural example, for instance, your best friend comes to you and says, I've got a new girlfriend or boyfriend. They're the #1 skateboarder in the world, and they speak 5 languages fluently, and they have a Banksy in their back garden. This is all those 3 facts, as it were, in this testimony are known to be plausible naturalistic events. We know that there is someone, we don't know who it is, but there is a person or people, Banksy, doing art on buildings. Maybe that's the case. Maybe someone can speak 5 languages fluently, and equally, someone somewhere is the #1 best skateboarder in the world, and certainly younger people are very, very good at skateboarding, and it is a sport that I quite enjoy, despite how I look. Yes. Anyway, the point being is that this is a series of events or facts that are being claimed by someone that each are quite improbable. But we have examples of, well, I know someone can speak 5 languages. That's plausible. It can happen. I have either heard of someone or it's on the news, or I can conceive of it. A resurrection is something where there is only one primary claim anyway. Equally, there's the case of Lazarus being raised from the dead by Jesus as a miracle in the Gospels. But primarily, it's the resurrection of Jesus in the Gospels that is our one kind of main case study here, ignoring and setting to one side the fact that there are many pagan religions that had stories of dying and rising gods. I'm not going to claim, as some do, that Christianity is just a copy and paste of those. I do think Christianity grew up in an era when those stories were accepted, but I definitely would refute on a historical basis the influence. But the key point that I would say is this claim of my girlfriend, boyfriend, #1 skateboarder in the world, and they speak 5 languages, and they have a Banksy in their back garden. Note that every "and" adds an extra element of skepticism. What, all 3? So every chain in this argument needs to be sound. Because it's, well, for example, did Jesus exist? For me, there's no doubt that you would throw out all of ancient history if you said Jesus didn't exist. Now, there are some fringe people that claim it, but I could address it, but I'm not going to, because I only have probably about 8 minutes remaining. So, did Jesus die by crucifixion around 30 in Jerusalem? Absolutely grant that. But those 2 are prerequisites. They are part of our "and" series. Then, was Jesus buried in an honourable fashion in an empty tomb as described in the Gospels? Now, this is a point of departure from the 4 facts that were kind of claimed by Joe here as granted by the vast majority of New Testament scholars. I would point to instances, and particularly more so in the present, where, and I follow them, I looked at 126 accounts of crucifixion in the ancient world. Yes, it was an interesting hobby that I have. And I looked at how many of these got buried. What was the point of crucifying someone? It was humiliating, an extremely painful way to die, and a horrible way to treat a human being. And the primary purpose was to deny burial and to humiliate and to act as a deterrent. Don't do what he did. Don't claim to be king of the Jews. Don't do it, or you'll end up like that. Most, essentially the vast majority. There are some cases, both on a textual level, and there is one archaeological find of a crucifixion victim that was buried. I could go into that. It might get a bit more technical. We'll see if we tangent down that route. But I don't believe that it is a guaranteed goal or a certainty that Jesus was buried honourably in a tomb by Joseph of Arimathea.
We're going to take a short break, but we'll be hearing the rest of Harry's presentation shortly. Please do let us know what you think. Get in touch, unbelievable@premier.org.uk.
I would ask Tom this, and this is a surprising question maybe, to nominate for me one thing, just one thing, that Christianity has introduced that doesn't have some source, some parallel, some analogy in previous and in other civilizations.
The ideal of lifelong matrimony, I think that's a very distinctive Christian concept. I think the category of what by the 19th century is coming to be categorized as homosexuality and heterosexuality, I think they have no precedence. I think the notion of secularism, the idea of there being religions, I think all these are entirely exclusive to Christian civilization. I think the concept of science as it emerges in the 19th century, I think is entirely exclusive to Christian civilization. I think the idea that human beings are created in the image of God, that is obviously something that Christians share with Jews. It gives a degree of dignity to human beings that no other cultural tradition that I'm aware of even remotely approximates.
Welcome back to our discussion about whether Jesus rose from the dead with Joe Boot and Harry Amos. Harry will continue to share his thoughts and then we'll discuss some of what has been said.
So, what evidence then is that there was an empty tomb? Firstly, there had to be a tomb, and now we are looking at an empty tomb. Well, fundamentally, it comes down to eyewitness testimony, or testimony of any kind. We don't have the most reliable evidences that you would have in a court of law. We don't have any kind of DNA evidence. We don't have any photographic. We only have testimony. Now, testimony is well known in law courts to be the least reliable form of testimony. And this is on a variety of grounds, and one of them being people can, their sense data can mislead them. When you have a crime, police often separate witnesses to understand, right, what was your account, so that there's no collaboration, essentially, of testimony. So you can establish independence, and that's another issue here, is that while there are 5, and we could debate around sources behind sources, but 5 sources of this claim, you have Mark, for example, being about 41% copied into the other Gospels in the synoptic group of 3, so that's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And so there's not independence there, there's interdependence. So we've got potential eyewitness testimony. Now, the vast majority of qualified New Testament scholars doubt that we have eyewitnesses firstly, Matthew and John, if they are who they claim to be, then they are potentially eyewitnesses. Certainly everyone would say Mark and Luke are not eyewitnesses, but rather that perhaps they got their evidence from eyewitnesses, Paul and Peter respectively. In that instance, we're dealing with hearsay. That's a second-hand account. That's, I heard Ruth say that Joe said that he has a new girlfriend, and that girlfriend has a Banksy, and so forth. So we're already again distanced. Furthermore, we don't have the original manuscripts. What manuscripts we do have, containing these extraordinary claims, contain significant differences. So, for example, if you read through the Gospels in your Bible, as Joe encourages you to do, and I would likewise, you'll notice that in Mark, there is a section in parentheses, or our earliest and best witnesses do not contain this longer ending to Mark. In fact, in the original form, it most likely ended with the women discovered the empty tomb, and they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. And that's an interesting place to kind of end your gospel. And so naturally, people may have come along and thought, hang on a minute, well, there are appearance stories. We should add those on to the end because that's not telling the whole story. Then there's, you may have heard the story of the woman caught in adultery. the law of Moses says we should stone this woman, and Jesus says, let he who is without sin be the first to cast a stone, and everyone goes, well, actually, I've sinned, so I should probably walk away and not stone her. Now, I loved this story as a Christian, but in fact, it's not original to the Gospel of John, where it's told. Our earliest and best manuscripts do not contain this. Now, what is an early manuscript? Now, this is certainly something that, so we do have a lot of manuscripts of the New Testament. I'm aware probably time I'm running through, but I wouldn't say I have too much more to say. So the manuscripts we have do vary, as I've said, but if we take the 1 Corinthians 15 as one example, that creed that he mentioned around Jesus was buried, he was seen by XYZ, then the first manuscript we have of that is Papyrus 46. Now, this is dated about 125 to 175 years after the event. That is a significant gap of time. I'm not saying that the original manuscript definitely did not contain, for example, he was buried or he appeared to one of the individuals that's named, but rather we can't know what the original said. We are in a position of agnosticism. So just a few other points. We aren't speaking the original language. The original language of the Gospels, all the New Testament, is Koine Greek. Now, to give an example of why this is important and why these two individuals studied theology and studied Greek, ancient Greek, is because it sometimes makes an important difference. So when we have in this creed the word appeared, horaro, Paul's usage of horaro is all intangible in nature. So, and equally you have in Revelation, a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. Another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads, 10 horns, 7 crowns on its heads. This is also exactly the same verb that is used in the creed. This causes doubt as to what does he mean when he says appeared? Is it physical? Is it a vision? What is it here? So equally, I guess I would take, and I could carry on all day, but Paul, I would say, is not a good eyewitness. Well, he's not an eyewitness at all, but he's certainly not a good source of information if we were to take him in a court of law. He is a fervent evangelist who often got on people's bad sides. He is described as falling down and having visions. It is speculated that he may have had epilepsy. Damascus Road experience is fully consistent with natural explanations. And I guess I'll wrap up by saying, and returning to my point earlier, even if along this chain of reasoning we assign, say, 75%, so we're 75% sure that Jesus was buried and women saw him at the empty tomb, and that we have the original manuscripts and so forth, each chain. If you assign 75% probability to each part of the chain of the premises, and let's say you have 3 premises, you already get to a probability of under 50%, because you multiply the probabilities, meaning that a rational judgment would be clear, that the claim is more likely to be false than to be true. There is a lot of ands here, a lot of gaps, and a lot of things I'm sure that we'll have a good conversation about.
Thank you, Harry. I suppose while it's still fresh in everyone's mind what Harry has just said, I've got some questions. But Joe, is there anything that you would like to come back at, respond, agree with, disagree with? Is there anything you'd want to say to Harry or question?
Well, I think where we're agreed is that everybody has to acknowledge on any side of a discussion about history and historical evidences that we don't have direct access, and therefore we have to, when we're thinking purely historically, we have to apply certain standards of criticism to historical texts. I think what you've heard from Harry is very interesting in terms of the degree of skepticism he's implying to such a well-attested document. We have somewhere in the region of about 5,000 in Greek, some 20,000 in total manuscripts of the New Testament. You can reconstruct most of the New Testament just from citations in the early church fathers. So one of the things that the majority of New Testament scholars aren't actually in a great deal of doubt about is that what we have today is substantially, textual criticism has substantially supported the fact that we don't have the original autographs, but if you compare similar ancient texts, the first copies we have are hundreds of years later. The New Testament, I think even Harry would have to agree, is remarkably well attested from that point of view. So I think there's the textual attestation for the New Testament is remarkably strong. N.T. Wright, a professor at Oxford, has written an 800-page book on this. The skepticism with which some people approach the New Testament, they would never approach other ancient documents. So I think what you hold in your hand when you hold the New Testament, notwithstanding some legitimate points that Harry made about, there are some questions about one or two passages. He cited John 8, I think, and the different ending to Mark. But again, even Harry, as a former Christian, would know that neither would affect any doctrine of Scripture. So there's two traditions there. There's the received text. There's the historically received text, which recognizes the longer ending to Mark and the passage in John 8. And there's later criticism, which would suggest, well, since these aren't in those two passages aren't in the most reliable and oldest manuscripts, we should treat those with some skepticism. I'm happy to grant that. And I think that too could be a point of agreement. Most of the so-called differences with the text are punctuation, the odd word difference here and there. The copying of the New Testament text has been remarkable in its accuracy. So there's just a general remark there. Secondly, just from the philosophical and worldview standpoint, I think Harry is coming at this as a methodological naturalist. So whilst he opens by saying, fundamentally, philosophically, I don't know, agnosticism, he is actually approaching the questions as a methodological naturalist. So remember, I made the distinction between the evidence and the explanation for the evidence. And the evidence that Jesus died, that he was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, who was a Jew, not a Christian. This is a very strange invention for any Christian legend, that he would be buried by a Jew, that he was then his resurrection was witnessed first by women who, in a Jewish court of law, Josephus tells us their testimony was not valid. So why would you cite, if you're going to invent a really compelling story, why would you use women whose testimony was not valid in an ancient Jewish court of law as your first witnesses? So the appearances of Christ, they're clearly not visions. They're not hallucinations, because these are appearances where Thomas is able to touch the hands and feet of Christ, where he is eating food with his disciples. So there's a difference between a vision and an appearance. So these are, the testimony here is that these are appearances. And then finally, the empty, sorry, did I say the empty tomb? The empty tomb, the women's testimony, the empty tomb, the appearances, and then the church's testimony. So you have to account for that. Christianity is here today. It's been here for 2,000 years. It conquered the Roman Empire. It spread throughout most of the known world, and it spread very, very quickly. And it was preached first in the very city where Jesus was crucified, when these things could have been falsifiable, where the body of Jesus could have been produced. And we don't have a competitive burial story. We don't have a competitive burial legend. And we have the proclamation of people who were willing to be thrown to the lions and persecuted, even Jesus' own brother killed, for his testimony that Jesus Christ was raised. That's what we call circumstantial evidence. So I grant what Harry is saying, that in a modern court of law, looking for DNA evidences and so on. Well, we're not talking about a modern court of law where there's DNA evidence or video evidence. We're talking about ancient history that needs to be subject to when we're looking at purely from an historian's perspective, to look at evidences that are applicable to that period. Now, I think you have seen in, and I'm taking the liberty of a minute or two here just because Harry went a tad over time, that I think we've seen in Harry's presentation the role that worldview, the role that philosophical assumptions play in how we are going to approach and tackle the evidence. He talked about historians' approach, probability, standards of evidence, and yet he began by saying that he is a skeptic about the existence of God, or at least he's an agnostic. I think that was, so an agnostic, which is a don't know position. Now, so to assume then methodological naturalism seems an interesting decision on the basis of a don't know. And actually, if you begin with, he said it is my starting point. I think that can only lead to a radical skepticism with respect to all of history. In fact, I'm not even sure how you can talk about probabilities in a non-theistic worldview. Because probability presupposes the idea of order, structure, law that governs our analysis of evidence, that presupposes actually the very nature of history. It was history as we understand it today in the modern West was a Christian development. The ancient Greeks just believed in meaningless cycles. So what we think about as history, as something which we can analyze and draw conclusions from, is very much a Christian understanding of how we can approach history. Because for the atheist, history is a random collocation of atoms. It's nothing more than meaningless events, brute facts, impervious to interpretation. Harry wants to borrow from my worldview, though, so that he can do an analysis of history and talk about probability and standards of evidence and laws of thought and so on and so forth.
Harry, I feel like you were sort of slightly itching to respond in the middle of that.
Sure.
I have questions for both of you, but I'm going to give you an opportunity to respond to what Joe's just said there.
Sure. So I will try and tackle, there was quite a lot to respond to there. So in terms of the manuscripts, for a start, so another point of agreement, there is about 25,000 or so manuscripts. One thing that is often not discussed in these kind of apologetic talks, it's 25,000. How many of those go back to, say, the 2nd century? And even if you're generous in your dating and you adopt when there's a window of uncertainty, the earlier date, closer to the time, you're still looking at 8 manuscripts that go back as close as the 2nd century, which means you're already looking at about 125, 150 years after the event. And that's a substantial gap for changes to have occurred in an era where, and I know that you'll grant that pseudepigrapha or forgeries went around in early Christian communities. And we will agree on that. And it's even indicated in the Bible that people were penning books in the name of other people. The end of the Book of Revelation warns people not to subtract or add anything to it, for example, because why would you need that warning if no one was doing these things? So in terms of the manuscripts, I'll end there. But in terms of, so you said, for example, that let's say the appearances, that Thomas was able to put his hand in the side of Jesus, that he ate broiled fish, and so forth. Well, there's also elements of intangibility there as well. So Jesus is able to walk through walls, essentially. So he has a spiritual nature that is different perhaps from a physical form. But more importantly, there's an element of this is for the Bible tells me so. These are narratives. It's almost circular logic here. If I am an apologist or a Christian trying to convince people in the ancient world, and people say, well, oh, maybe people were just having visions. Well, no, Jesus ate fish. No, Thomas, even a disciple who doubted, was able to stick his hand in the hole marks of the crucifixion nails. Then that counters the objection, but it is, again, in the book. It's not something that is outside. It's not external to the narrative. You say about martyrs, one thing I would emphasize is that the majority of the 12 disciples disappear very quickly out of reliable history. So the martyrdom, and I noticed you were very careful, and I like that, in that they were willing to die for their faith, because the evidence that they did die with any element of certainty or high likelihood is very, you can doubt it very easily, shall we say. It comes hundreds of years after the event. You mentioned James, however. I agree. So the historian Josephus records that James, the brother of Jesus, was killed. Doesn't say was martyred. For someone to be a martyr, I would say you have to be killed not for political reasons or because someone doesn't like you, but because of your religious faith. And you also have to have an opportunity to recant. We are not told why in particular James was killed. It was with the sword, from my memory. We are not told whether he had any chance to say, actually, no, I don't like the idea of dying. I won't die for my faith. He was just killed. So, is he a martyr? Is a question mark. Methodological naturalism was another point that you made, and I agree. There is a it's called the Munchausen trilemma, essentially, as a nice technical term for everyone.
Break it down for us. Come on, Harry.
So basically, it says it's in epistemology, the philosophy of how do we know things. So you're basically always caught on one of three horns, or like with a trident, the forks. You're going to get caught on infinite regress. There is an explanation for an explanation for an explanation for an explanation, and there's no end point to that. You're either going to go, this is just self-evidential, it's a brute fact, a bit like Descartes, the philosopher, said, I think, therefore I am, because it would be absurd to doubt my own existence. I could be an elephant for all I know, I could be a brain in a vat, but I know that in some capacity I exist. Or it's circular reasoning. And this is a big problem in philosophy, and it's been a problem, it's a known problem for thousands of years now. So I think that both of us are in that position of circularity. I think that there is no escape from that. To me, naturalism seems to be, at least from a methodological point of view, rather than a dogmatic point of view, the most rational position to adopt. If I look at, for example, a circular chain of reasoning, so I know I'm slightly erring onto the territory of presuppositionalism, and I'll let you define that, but the Bible is the foundation of all logic and consciousness and morality and everything. You can do exactly the same with, say, the Quran. You can assume any foundation that you wish. And so I agree, we're both in a very difficult position in that regard. But to my mind, the easiest way is to say, well, I'm an agnostic, I don't know. Miracles feel like they should be low down the list of probabilities of explanations for an event. So here's my bar of evidence.
We're going to take a quick break, but if you're enjoying the show, please do consider rating it and giving us a review on your preferred podcast platform so that more people can find it. We'll be back shortly to hear Harry and Joe answer young people's questions.
We are launching a brand new course which helps us to consider the evidence and questions around the birth of Jesus. It's called Did It Really Happen? The Birth of Jesus. Why not sign up for the course or gift it to a friend? Find out more at premierunbelievable.com.
Welcome back to the final part of Unbelievable, where we're asking the question, did Jesus rise from the dead? I was joined live at Aylesbury High School by Christian Joe Boot and agnostic atheist Harry Amos. We're going to finish off the discussion we started in the previous section, and then we'll answer questions from some of the young people who attended the event.
Thanks, Harry. I feel like we're maybe going to take it slightly down away from the philosophy.
Yep.
Just so... presumably, what you think has happened is effectively legend. You think the stories are legend. They've developed over time. The resurrection narrative has gone from Jesus not raising from the dead, but over time that has developed, and that's where we've gone. Presumably, part of that is because you don't trust, as you say, you don't trust those documents, you don't trust the Gospels, you don't trust Paul. Would you come back on that? Because presumably you do trust the Gospels and you do trust Paul. Why, in your opinion, do you think they are trustworthy? I know you've touched on this already, but would you just respond a little bit to that, if you would, Joe?
Well, I don't think they show evidence of collusion. Certainly, and again, it's an appeal to authority when anybody talks about, the majority of New Testament critics, I grant that. But New Testament critics do agree that we are dealing with different sources for at least some of the Gospels. And one of the reasons we have what theologians call the synoptic problem is that there are differences in the way that the Gospels relate certain accounts. Those differences are the kind of differences you would expect if 4 of you were to write an account of what happened today at this discussion or this debate, and we would get, I think, 4 very interesting reflections on the day that would not contradict one another but complement one another. One of the things that I find most compelling about the Gospels is the fact that they relate the same core issues, the same core doctrines, the same core accounts of the life of Christ, but they don't show evidence of collusion. And there's been clearly no effort by the Christian Church to try and manipulate those texts to give easy resolution to some of the things that critics have pointed out and said, well, how do we resolve this or that? So circumstantially, that's very good evidence that these are eyewitness testimonies that reflect the kind of differences you would expect when any group of people give an account of certain events. Paul the Apostle, well, first of all, we do know that he was writing very early. He was probably converted in AD 33. His letter to the Galatians, I'm sure we'd all agree, this is very, very early documents. This is a man who was a Jew by training. He studied at the feet of Gamaliel, one of the most famous Jewish teachers of the time. He said he was a Pharisee of Pharisees. He was of one particular school. And he was a persecutor of Christians. He was actually dragging them off to jail. He was holding the coats of those that stoned the Apostle Stephen, who in the Book of Acts, as a martyr, is executed for his faith. For his convictions about Jesus Christ. He sees him, and that is a vision, not an appearance. He sees a vision of Christ at the right hand of God. So Paul is a very, very interesting case because his conversion happens on the Damascus Road. Others hear the voice and see the light that he sees. He's struck blind, and Paul is converted to the faith and becomes the great evangelist, the great apostle, who we do know spent time with, or at least we know from the ancient witnesses, that he went to spend time with Peter and James. And these are the people that lived with Jesus. These are, in some cases, the relatives of Jesus. James and John, Jesus' cousins. James, the brother of Jesus. Peter, one of the most important central disciples, who's the authority, most agree, behind the Gospel of Mark. we can't talk about historical certainty in the sense of mathematical proof. You can't talk about mathematical proofs of any ancient text, and even when we come to mathematics, philosophers aren't agreed on what numbers actually are. So I would say, again, you either say, well, we're going to be radical skeptics about ancient testimony, and really we can dismiss huge swathes of what we think we know about ancient history because we simply don't have well, let's think about Socrates, for example, and what we know about Socrates. They're much later than New Testament sources, but historians and philosophers don't doubt that what we have from Plato is substantially accurate about Socrates. We don't subject these texts to that kind of doubt. With regard to the broader, I think, the broader question about, whether I think Harry is correct that philosophers do know that an argument, a logical argument, begins with premises and ends in a conclusion, and the conclusion is entailed in the premise. So that's the nature of a syllogism. So you argue from a major and a minor premise to a conclusion, and they're entailed in one another if it's going to be a valid argument. That you do have to say, let me put it to you this way, everybody has to say somewhere along the line, here is my source of authority. Somebody says for each of us, because I said so, right? I'm a dad, I've got 3 children, they're grown now, and sometimes I'd be being asked why by my kids, and sometimes you just have to get to the point where you say, because I said so. Now, we have to all decide in our lives what is the ground and source of our authority. Is it skeptical philosophers? Is it Oprah? Is it going to be the Eightfold Path of the Buddha? Is it going to be the Quran? Now, the Quran, its textual history is extremely interesting. And the first biography of Muhammad we have is about 150 years after the fact. It doesn't compare remotely to the New Testament testimony. So when we come into a critical engagement with other worldviews, because you have this issue of the what Harry called the circularity, not a vicious circle, but a circularity in the reasoning, that's when we do an internal critique of different worldviews. You have to step in, I put your lenses on and say, okay, I'm going to step into your worldview a minute, and we're going to internally critique that worldview to see if it's intelligible. You do the same with the Christian world and life view. So that's where I think that issue plays a role. And then we haven't touched on in terms of the reliability of the text that you asked about, some of the other circumstantial evidence. So we have, for example, ossuaries, which are the burial urns of people in the ancient world. And we have ossuaries dating from 20 years after the death and resurrection of Christ, testifying to the belief in the resurrection. So we also have archaeological evidence, which and that could be talked about at great length too. So there are multiple lines of evidence. It's not just what we say about the texts. There are multiple lines of evidence for the authenticity of these claims, and at least for the conviction that these people, these early witnesses, really believed that Jesus Christ had been raised from the dead. We've not got a video, and they didn't tweet it, at the time, but we do have the testimony of God's word, and the question becomes, and I've just called it God's word, I grant, we do have to ask ourselves the question, who can say with authority, because I said so? For me, that's Jesus Christ and the word which he said had carried total authority.
Brilliant, thank you. We are very tight on time, and I really want to get to everyone else's questions.
Yeah.
But can I just ask you one question, Harry? Because as you were saying all this, going back to what Joe was saying, and I know you've touched on it as well, this idea of legal proof. They say in the court of law, don't they, proof beyond reasonable doubt.
Yes.
I know we can't empirically 100% prove the resurrection, but is there anything that would give you proof beyond reasonable doubt if it was presented to you right now that Jesus did rise from the dead?
So there's not one thing. I think there could be a multitude of things. But equally, let's say, I had a personalized experience. Well, people have visions all the time of, say, post-bereavement. Many people will say, I saw my husband and he was alive and walking around and talking to me. So I would doubt personal experience if it was the case that, me, you, and all of you saw Jesus here. We all were like, oh, let's shake hands, let's have a meal. There's elements of, right, this is adding up more to a substantial case. So there's not one thing.
Okay, so it'd be like a cumulative
thing.
Great. Has anyone got any questions? I know there was a lot, and some of it got quite philosophical. Excellent. So that's a question presumably to Harry, right? So this is about the manuscripts and the changes that have been made from the earliest manuscripts to the later manuscripts. How would you account for those changes?
How do they happen is because people were writing with their hand, and people would, and I agree, the vast majority, by a long shout, you mentioned some number, I didn't catch exactly what it was, but they are simply, when you're writing and you skip a line, or there's no dictionary in the ancient world, you would spell things differently. It's more the case that I would say changes can happen in the manuscript tradition that are important early on and we wouldn't know. And this is the time, the earlier back we go, that we start to have greater difference emerging. When you look at, say, the Gospel of Mark, and then you read Matthew, you read Luke, and you read John, that's assuming a kind of, some people would order the dates differently, but that's kind of the general picture of dating how many years they go out. You see a pattern of legendary development, and that Mark, the original ending, of course, has there was no appearances, and then you have more active, the stone was rolled away by an angel who came in, you have miracles happening at the crucifixion of Jesus, you have an eclipse, you have the temple of the curtain torn in two, you have this trajectory of legendary development. I wouldn't get hung up on manuscripts, because it's more a case of we don't know than I know they happened.
Joe, would you have anything to say to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's actually a really good question. Knowing the commitment to accuracy of ancient copyists and the incredible agreement across, don't forget, they weren't just Greek manuscripts, they're a variety of different languages that we have these manuscripts in. As I said, even the citations in the Church Fathers. So we have an incredibly accurate picture of what the original text said. Now, what Harry is saying is that, well, yeah, but we don't know whether, most think that Mark was written probably between AD 40 and at the very latest AD 60, and that Mark is probably the oldest of the Gospels. I would dispute that there's legendary development. Because there's a theological purpose in the way the Gospel writers are also approaching what they're saying. So it's not just a question of, don't forget, in the ancient world, histories weren't written in quite the same way that we would go about in the modern West of writing a history. They weren't specifically interested in a blow-by-blow detailed account, and every historian is having to be selective. I mean, if you were writing an account of your day-to-day, in order not to bore the person listening to tears, you would be selective. You would be saying, okay, well, let's say you were trying to give an account of your month, you would pick the highlights. You would pick the things that really stood out. And if you were trying to make a particular point about your life and what was going on in it, you might select things with a particular purpose that you're looking to emphasize. And that's without us talking about the fact that the premise, of course, that you need to add to the resurrection, the historical evidence for the resurrection is that God exists. Now, if the Christian claim is that God is, of course, guiding and supervening in the issue of the not only the inspiration of the Gospels, but in their transmission. And the ancient Jewish way of learning of the disciples would have been you attached yourself to a teacher, you learned their teachings, you would learn them by rote, you would learn them by memory. So, and you would then commit those things. Well, in this case, they are then that what you've committed to memory is then committed to a written document. So, the idea that these are legends, I just don't think we have the time. We don't have adequate time. That's not how legends develop. Legends build up over a period of time. You often need a great deal of distance from an event actually happening for legends to start forming. I would say, for example, the Gospel according to Peter, an apocryphal work, probably the second half of the 2nd century. That is evidently a forgery. You have, these two men emerging from the tomb, and they're giants. Their heads are in the clouds, and a cross comes out of the tomb and makes a great statement. Those are legends. That's what ancient legend looks like. That's what mythology looks like. When you read the Gospels, read them for yourself if you haven't, and you read them carefully, you can tell you're reading something that these people believe is true history, that it really happened, but it doesn't mean that it's not without a theological purpose. So I would have a high degree of confidence in terms of what you're saying, that based on what we have manuscripts-wise, that we can have a high degree of confidence. And I think the distances in terms of the time of writing from the time of the events is so close that legendary accretions, because you're talking about the time when these people are still alive. I mean, it's very difficult to pass off legends. I mean, you're preaching the good news of the resurrection, for example, in Jerusalem, where Jesus has been crucified. There's the known location of his body. And you're declaring these things. And Paul is even claiming there at around AD 53 that most of the witnesses of the resurrection are still alive. That's all falsifiable. Why don't we see a series of different legendary developments about alternate stories for the burial of Jesus? What we do find coming out much later, like the Gospel according to Peter, are easily identifiable as mythological and legendary. That would be my initial response to that. Although I am not claiming to be a textual expert or an expert in ancient legend.
Neither am I. I would just pick up on... could easily go and check out these things for themselves. Now, when Paul writes his letter to the Corinthians, and he's giving this creed statement.
1 Corinthians 15, yeah.
Yep, 1 Corinthians 15.
Yep.
He is writing to Corinth. Corinth is around about, it's over 1,000 miles from Jerusalem. How many people would have the means, the motive to go on a journey, not by plane but by foot, and go and ask, is Peter around? Do you know where he is? Can I ask him? And we're talking again in 53. Lifespans in the ancient world were much shorter than ours. And equally, there's the claim around the 500 eyewitnesses that we haven't touched on. They are unnamed. It's all well and good saying, go to a city 1,000 miles away and try and find some people that claim to have all seen Jesus at the same time. Good luck. Have a safe journey 1,000 miles away.
I might just put a pin in that discussion, although I have heard someone say that apparently they would go to the Passover every year in Jerusalem. I know that doesn't completely answer your question, but let's move to another question, because I feel like we could go on forever and ever. We'll come back to you in a sec. Yes, that is an excellent question. So that was about the question I previously asked Harry, is there anything that would convince you that the resurrection did happen? Flipping it over to you, Joe, is there anything that would come out that would convince you that the resurrection did not happen?
Yeah, if somebody can produce the body of Jesus, or show that he's still in the tomb. So Paul says, if Christ is not raised, we are still in our sins. So the early church acknowledged, and I grant Corinth is a long way away, but the other apostles are all preaching this in Jerusalem, Judea, while these witnesses are still alive. The early church was not complacent about the fact that if Christ has not been raised, your faith is in vain, you are still in your sins. Paul made that crystal clear. So yes, if somebody can produce the body of Jesus, I'm sure that would have shattered the faith and the confidence of the early church. Do I believe that's going to happen? No.
Anything else? Because the body of Jesus is quite a bit of a high bar.
Fairly decayed now as well, wouldn't it?
Is there anything other than that?
Or do you think the evidence is so overwhelmingly in its favour?
I mean, I think that we've been, whether it's through, the textual criticism, whether it's through archaeological excavation and so on and so forth, that for me, the evidence is both compelling and encouraging, by the very nature of the reason that I'm a Christian. I mean, I would be lying to you if I said I'm a Christian because somebody sat me down, a historian, an archaeologist, a New Testament critic, and said, here's all the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. And I went, that's compelling. I'll be a Christian. That's not why I'm a Christian. I'm a Christian because I've met myself. I'm not saying I've put my hands into his hands and feet, but I have met myself. I know the resurrected Lord Jesus Christ. And so that is the fundamental reason that I'm a Christian. However, it's not a baseless. It's not something that is without argument or evidence. And so I think it behooves Christians to be honest about that, as I've said and acknowledged in the context of this debate, we don't have a carbon copy of history anywhere. We don't have direct access to it. Now, that doesn't mean, and I've said, you need the additional premise of the existence of God with respect to the resurrection. That's critically important. But you can appeal to entities that you don't have direct access to. I mean, this is common practice in science. Any of you seen, other universes or strings or inflation or dark matter? We make appeal to, in other areas, to things to which we don't have direct access in order to make a case for something. So from the historian's point of view, from a sort of a critical point of view, I would say the evidence for Christ's resurrection and the authenticity of the New Testament text is highly compelling. Is it demonstrable historically? No more than any other historical event is absolutely 100% demonstrable, but that's not why I'm a Christian.
Anything to add?
No.
Great. Okay, to you. Yeah. Brilliant question. Sorry, Harry, I'm just going to repeat it. So this is around effectively the change in attitude of the disciples, how they went from being quite scared, not sure what's happened, to sort of fearlessly preaching the gospel. What would you say if that wasn't indicative on Jesus rising from the dead?
Sure. So I guess the first thing I would point to is faiths grow, or religions, or whatever term you want to use, they can grow very quickly. And take Islam, for example. Now, I know the circumstance is very, very different, but Islam had and remains a very fast-growing religion, and the claims of Islam and Christianity are incompatible. So it's not that there are not naturalistic accounts of why faith can grow rapidly. Certainly later expansion, you mentioned, conquered the Roman Empire. There are many factors behind that, including, I would say, actually the early church. I think there's very good evidence to say they were very generous and charitable. They included women and slaves, and that made them quite popular among those groups. Equally, there's a lot of different reasons, but if you have someone like Peter and Paul, and I would argue that there's very strong evidence they had some experience, some vision or revelation, that is enough to get the ball rolling. I think that once that is the case, then someone can be very convincing. Muhammad had visions in a cave that became the Quran, and those were convincing to people. And things, as we know, snowballed from there.
Anything to add, Joe?
Yeah, I think you've cited a very important piece of circumstantial, what we would call circumstantial evidence, that it isn't easy to offer a purely naturalistic account of how people who were not expecting the physical resurrection of Jesus, because some of the Jews believed in a general resurrection at the end of the world, but not in this kind of resurrection. Their expectations had been shattered, they're dejected, they're going back to their old lives. You've got the account on the Emmaus Road, I think in Luke's Gospel, which is compelling in that regard. So the transformation that took place in those people's lives is very difficult to account for outside of a genuine belief that Jesus had actually been raised from the dead. To turn you into a force that is prepared to go out, and I agree with Harry, there was generosity, there was transformation in the view of women and the status of ordinary people, slaves within the Roman Empire, that certainly accelerated the growth of Christianity. But its root was in, if you think about the meaning of baptism, burial, resurrection, the sacraments of the church, the baptism is one, communion would just be a memorial to a dead person. And we know that this was the very early practice of the church. Jesus institutes it, but we see it because the early church is accused of cannibalism because of their rites of communion, the bread, the wine, the idea that this is a celebration of Christ's death and his work till he come again because he's alive. So this transformation of turning a fearful group of people who believe that their world has ended, their Messiah is now dead, and that's it, it's over. I mean, we see that in the raising of Lazarus, which Harry mentioned in passing, where the women say, well, yes, we know he will rise at the last day. There was that kind of expectation, but no expectation of the resurrection of Jesus on the third day after his crucifixion. So that is a significant piece of evidence.
I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. Thank you so much to my guests, Rev Dr Joseph Boot and Harry Amos. We would love to know what you think. Please do connect with us on social media at Premier Unbelievable. And don't forget to give us a quick review on your podcast platform if you're enjoying the show. Thank you for joining us on Unbelievable, and see you next time.